The cabin wasn't just a ruin, it was a tomb. Fletcher Bannon stood at the edge of the clearing, his last shred of hope snapping like a dry twig. The place his Uncle Theodore had left them was a wreck. Moss grew on the roof like a thick green carpet. The windows were black, gaping holes. The porch sagged like a tired old man. Beside him, his twin brother Royce said nothing. His jaw was set, his eyes hollow. They'd walked for 3 days to get here. 3 days with empty bellies and boots worn thin. They drank from streams and slept on the cold ground. All for this. A pile of rotting wood deep in a forest that felt like it was trying to swallow them whole. Max, their dog, didn't see the despair. He let out a sharp, happy bark, his tail wagging. To him, this was just another adventure. He had no idea they were standing on the edge of a cliff. He had no idea they were about to fall. Fletcher thought about the lawyer's letter. It had arrived 2 weeks ago, a thick, official envelope. Their uncle, Theodore Quill, was dead. The man who'd vanished from their lives 15 years ago. A ghost long before he died. And he had left them everything. Hope. Fletcher had felt a flicker of stupid, desperate hope. Maybe this was it. Their chance. A way out of the dirt. But looking at this cabin, he knew the truth. Theodore had left them nothing but another burden. Another broken thing in a life full of broken things. "We should have stayed," Royce finally said, his voice flat. Staying meant more back-breaking work on other men's land. More nights spent sleeping in barns. More hunger. It meant nothing. Max barked again and shot toward the cabin. Fletcher was too tired to call him back. Let the dog have his fun. Let someone get something good out of this trip. They walked closer, the ground crunching under their boots. The cabin was even worse up close. The door hung off one hinge. You could see straight through the walls in places. Inside, it was a mess of shadows and debris. A flipped table, a broken chair. This is where their uncle had lived, alone, for 15 years. The Uncle Fletcher remembered was loud and full of laughter. What could turn a man like that into a hermit who would hide himself in a place like this? Then Max started barking again. Not the happy bark from before. This was frantic, insistent. It was coming from behind the cabin. Fletcher and Royce exchanged a look. They walked around the side, stepping over rotted logs. The backyard was a sea of weeds. And there was Max, digging. Digging like his life depended on it, near the base of an old, gnarled oak tree. His whole body shook with the effort. Something cold twisted in Fletcher's gut. Max dug all the time, but this was different. He kept looking back at them, whining, as if to say, "Look! Look what I found!" Fletcher knelt beside the hole. The dirt was soft, looser and darker than the soil around it. Someone had dug here before. He started clearing handfuls of earth. His fingers brushed against something wrapped in old cloth. His breath caught in his throat. Royce crouched beside him. Together they pulled it out. It was a small bundle, tied with a cord that crumbled to dust in their hands. Fletcher unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a book. A small, leather-bound diary. It was stained and old, but the pages were still there. He opened it. The handwriting was a mess, cramped and shaky. He read the first line out loud. "September 3rd. I found it today, the thing I have been searching for. God help me, I found it." Royce leaned closer. The next few entries were just as strange. Fletcher flipped forward, his eyes scanning the frantic scribbles. He stopped at a passage underlined so hard the pen had torn the paper. 1 Timothy 6:10. "The love of money is the root of all evil." And below that, in Theodore's shaky hand, it shone so bright it blinded Judas. For his betrayal, he was buried with 30 coins. "What does that mean?" Royce whispered. His face had gone pale. Fletcher didn't know. He turned the page. More cryptic notes. More Bible verses about greed. And then, one final entry that made his blood run cold. God forgive me for what I had to do. It is buried where no one will find it, in the ground, with the man who would have killed me for it." Max barked again, a single sharp sound that pulled their eyes back to the hole. And there, in the dirt, was a glint of yellow. Something small and round. Fletcher reached for it, his hand trembling. It was a coin, an old gold coin. It was heavy, real. He looked at the diary. He looked at the coin. He looked at Max, who was still digging, his paws a blur, as if he knew there was more. And Fletcher understood. Whatever their uncle had buried here, it wasn't just gold. It was a grave. Fletcher couldn't stop staring at the coin. Real gold. He'd never even seen real gold before. His life was measured in copper pennies and sweat. This little piece of metal was worth more than he'd earned in the last year. It felt heavy in his palm, not just with weight, but with secrets. Royce was still hunched over the diary, his lips moving as he tried to decipher their uncle's frantic scrawl. Max had finally stopped digging and sat panting between them, proud of his discovery, completely unaware of the darkness he'd just unearthed. Fletcher turned the coin over. The markings were almost gone, worn smooth by dirt and time. How long had it been down there? Where did a man like Theodore get something like this? Poor men didn't find gold. Not unless they took it. The hunger in his stomach was a sharp biting pain. They hadn't eaten in over a day. His whole body felt hollow, empty. And holding this coin, this impossible piece of wealth, somehow made the emptiness feel even deeper. Royce finally looked up. In the fading light, his face was a mask of fear. "We should put it back," he said, his voice a low whisper. "The diary, the coin, everything. We should bury it and walk away." Fletcher stared at him. "Are you insane?" He stood up, clenching the coin in his fist. "This is it, Royce. This could change everything for us." "Or it could destroy us," Royce shot back, standing with him. He held the diary like it was a snake. "You read what he wrote? About Judas? About betrayal? About burying a man? Whatever this is, it drove him mad. It cost him his life." "He died of a fever," Fletcher said. But the words sounded weak, even to him. That's what the lawyer said. Found 3 weeks later. Alone. But now, that story felt too simple. Too clean. "You don't know that," Royce insisted. "You don't know what happened in this place. All we know is that our uncle found something that turned him into a ghost, something that made him hide from the world until he died. We can walk away right now, Fletch. We can pretend we never saw this. Once we dig deeper, there's no going back." Fletcher wanted to scream. Walk away? Walk away to what? Back to starving? Back to breaking their backs for other men? But a part of him knew Royce was right. This gold hadn't brought their uncle happiness. It brought him fear, isolation, a lonely death in a ruined cabin. This wasn't a treasure. It felt like a curse. Max barked again, sharp and loud. Both brothers spun around. The dog was back at the hole, digging with a furious energy he hadn't shown before. Dirt flew from between his paws. He was digging deeper, faster, like he could sense something else was down there. Something bigger. Fletcher looked at Royce. He saw his own desperate conflict mirrored in his brother's eyes. The fear was there, yes, but so was the need. The terrible, gnawing need to know. They didn't say a word. They walked toward the hole together. Whatever was buried there, they were about to find it, and it was going to change them forever. The light was failing fast. The air grew cold. Max had dug down almost 3 feet, his entire front half disappearing into the earth. Fletcher dropped to his knees and started clawing at the loose soil with his bare hands. His fingers were already raw, but he barely felt it. The cold and the adrenaline had numbed him. Royce hesitated for a second, then joined him. They dug in silence, their breathing harsh in the quiet forest. The only sound was the scraping of their hands in the dirt, and the thumping of Fletcher's own heart. The soil felt wrong. Too loose, as if it had been disturbed not so long ago and never had the time to properly settle. Theodore's words echoed in his mind. Buried, with the man who would have killed me for it. He tried to tell himself his uncle had gone mad, that it was just the rambling of a lonely, sick old man. But the weight of the coin in his pocket felt too real. Then his hand hit something solid. It wasn't a rock. It was flat and smooth. Wood. His heart hammered against his ribs. He clawed away more dirt, his movements frantic. A shape began to emerge from the dark earth. A box. An old wooden chest. Royce saw it at the same time and froze, his breath catching in his throat. They looked at each other across the hole, their faces pale masks in the twilight. They knew. Without a single word, they both knew. Together, they worked their fingers under the edges and lifted. It was heavier than it looked. Way heavier. As they pulled it free from the ground, something inside shifted with a sound that turned Fletcher's blood to ice. The clink of metal on metal, the sound of coins, hundreds of them. Fletcher's hands shook as he fumbled with the lid. The latch was rusted through. It crumbled into brown flakes under his fingers. "Don't," Royce whispered, backing away from the hole. He wrapped his arms around himself, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, Fletch, don't open it." He wanted it to stay buried for a reason. "We're already here, Royce," Fletcher said, his voice raspy. "We already found it. It's too late to turn back now." "It's not," Royce insisted. "Right now, we're just two brothers who found an old diary. But if you open that box, we become something else. We become part of it." Fletcher knew he was right. This was the moment. The choice that would define the rest of their lives. He could leave the box. Walk away and go back to the hunger and the hopelessness. Or he could open it and face whatever darkness came with it. He looked at his brother, at the fear in his eyes. He looked at the ruined cabin, a monument to their family's failure. He thought of all the cold nights and empty stomachs. "I'm sorry," Fletcher said. Then he lifted the lid. For a second, he couldn't breathe. It was filled with coins. Gold and silver spilling over each other, gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. It was a fortune. More money than he had ever dreamed of. It was salvation, right there in a rotting wooden box. Royce let out a choked sob. But Fletcher's eyes weren't on the gold. They were on the hole. On the spot where the box had been. Because Max was still digging. And in the dark soil, the dog had just uncovered something else. Something long and pale and horribly, unmistakably human. A bone. Fletcher gently set the box of coins on the ground, his mind reeling. He crept closer to the hole. Max had uncovered more of it now. A long, pale femur, half buried in the dark earth. Then a piece of a rib cage. This wasn't just a bone. It was a skeleton. Royce stood frozen a few feet away, his hand clamped over his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was a strangled gasp. "Theodore. He killed someone." Fletcher didn't answer. He couldn't. The proof was right there, lying in the dirt. A secret grave. A man murdered and buried in the backyard. Max whined softly and backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. Even the dog knew this was wrong. This was a place of death. Fletcher forced his eyes away from the skeleton and back to the gold. There had to be 100 coins in that box. A king's ransom. It was the answer to all their problems. Freedom. A future. And it was soaked in blood. "We have to go," Royce said, his voice suddenly firm. "Right now, we leave it all and we never come back." Fletcher looked at his brother, disbelief warring with desperation. "And go where? Back to begging for scraps? Back to working ourselves into an early grave for men who don't even know our names?" "We go back to not being grave robbers!" Royce yelled, his voice cracking. We go back to being able to sleep at night. Our Uncle Fletch, our uncle was a murderer. He killed a man and buried him with stolen gold. And you want to take it? You want to build our future on top of that? Fletcher had no answer. Every starving cell in his body screamed at him to take the money and run, to disappear and start over. But Royce was right. Taking that gold meant taking on the sin that came with it. It meant carrying the weight of this dead man for the rest of their lives. The diary, Fletcher said, grabbing at the last straw of hope. Maybe it explains it. Maybe he had a reason. Self-defense. Maybe this man tried to kill him first. Royce laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Or maybe Theodore killed him for the gold, Fletch. Maybe he wasn't alone when he found it. Maybe he murdered his partner so he wouldn't have to share. The thought was like a punch to the gut. Fletcher didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny it was possible. They didn't know the truth. The only two people who did were dead. One from a fever, the other from something far worse. We need to read the whole diary, Fletcher insisted. Every word, from the beginning. We need to know what happened before we decide anything. Royce stared at him, a battle raging in his eyes. Survival versus morality, greed versus fear. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. Fine, we read it. Inside. Away from that. He couldn't even look at the hole. And then we decide. We take the money and become monsters, or we walk away and stay men. They carried the heavy box of coins and the diary into the dark, decaying cabin. Fletcher found some broken furniture to start a fire, the flickering light pushing back the shadows. Royce opened the diary to the first page. The air grew thick with tension. They were about to read their uncle's confession. And Fletcher knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever secrets were written on those pages, there would be no coming back from them. The first few pages were what you'd expect from a lonely old man. Theodore wrote about the weather, about fixing the leaky roof, about the crushing loneliness that sometimes made it hard to breathe. Fletcher read the words aloud, and he could almost hear his uncle's voice, a ghost in the ruined cabin. Then the story changed. May 14th, Fletcher read, his own voice dropping lower. Saw smoke from the old Pritchard place. No one's lived there in decades. Going to check it out tomorrow. May 15th, the Pritchard cabin is a ruin, but I found something in the rubble. A metal box, rusted shut. Took me all day to get it open. Inside. Gold. More gold than a man could dream of. Coins from a time long past. A treasure someone hid and never came back for. Royce leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the fire, listening intently. May 17th. I made a terrible mistake. I told Virgil, my best friend, my brother in all but blood. I was bursting with the news. I had to tell someone. I showed him the coins, and for just a second, I saw something change in his eyes. A flash of darkness. Then it was gone, and he was smiling, clapping me on the back. But I saw it. I saw the greed. Fletcher paused, his throat suddenly dry. Keep going, Royce urged, his voice tight. Fletcher turned the page. May 20th. Virgil comes by every day now, always asking questions. How much is there? Where did I find it? Have I told anyone else? I keep telling him no, it's our secret. But he keeps asking. He seems obsessed. June 2nd. I caught him searching the cabin today. He thought I was outside chopping wood. He said he was looking for a hammer. I didn't believe him. His eyes keep going to the loose floorboard where I hid the box. Fletcher's hands started to shake. He read the next entry, his voice barely a whisper. June 8th. He came for me tonight. I was asleep when I heard the floorboards creak. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even. I felt him standing over my bed, just standing there, in the dark. Then I heard it, the sound of a knife sliding from its sheath. He was going to kill me in my sleep. I moved without thinking. I grabbed his wrist. We fought, crashing through the dark. He was strong, stronger than I ever knew. His hands were on my throat. His knife was searching for my ribs. My own hands found his neck. And I squeezed. I squeezed because if I let go, I was dead. I held on until he stopped moving. Until he went limp. Until my oldest friend lay dead on the floor, and I was alive. Fletcher's voice broke. Royce had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Fletcher forced himself to read the last part. June 9th. I buried him today. I buried him deep with 30 of the coins, like Judas, for his betrayal. The love of money is the root of all evil. I see that now. It corrupts. It turns good men into killers. This gold is cursed, but I can't get rid of it. I can't let it go, because I am corrupted too. The moment I took his life, I became a monster, and I will carry this weight until I die. The entry ended. The next few pages were ripped out. When the writing started again, it was wild, illegible. Just Bible verses and the same 3 words, scrawled over and over and over. God forgive me. God forgive me. God forgive me. Fletcher closed the diary. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. So now we know, Royce said, his voice hollow. It was self-defense. That's what you wanted, right? For our uncle not to be a murderer? But it wasn't that simple. Theodore had killed to save his own life, yes. But then he hid the body. He kept the gold. He let Virgil's family wonder for 15 years what had happened to him. He chose the treasure over the truth. And that choice had eaten him alive, rotting him from the inside out until he died, alone and full of guilt. What do we do now? Fletcher asked. Royce looked up, and in the dim light, his eyes looked ancient, filled with a terrible sadness. I don't know, he said. But then Royce saw something. At the very back of the diary, 2 pages were stuck together with what looked like dried mud. He carefully worked them apart. There was more writing, a final hidden entry. And what it said changed everything. The handwriting on the hidden page was different. It was small, neat, and controlled. It wasn't the frantic scrawl of a man losing his mind. It was the careful accounting of a businessman. It was a list of names, and next to each name, a number. Virgil Granger, 30 coins. Sheriff Miller, 15 coins. Judge Putnam, 20 coins. The list went on. Names of powerful men from the next county over, and the numbers next to their names were staggering. Fletcher and Royce stared at the page, their blood turning to ice. This wasn't a confession. It was a ledger, a record of bribes. Virgil wasn't a partner who had turned greedy. He was a courier, a bag man. And their uncle Theodore. He wasn't a victim. He was the one pulling the strings. He didn't just find the gold, Royce whispered, his voice filled with a new kind of horror. He was stealing it, little by little, from someone. The story in the diary, the fight, the self-defense. It was all a lie. A carefully crafted story to justify a murder. Theodore had killed Virgil not because he was attacked, but because Virgil was a loose end. A witness. He had murdered his best friend in cold blood to protect his criminal enterprise. The weight of this new truth was suffocating. Their uncle wasn't a haunted man. He was a cold, calculating killer and a thief. And they were standing in his house, holding his stolen gold, with his victim buried just a few yards away. They didn't sleep. How could they? The night was filled with the ghosts of their uncle's crimes. When the sun finally rose, gray and weak, they still hadn't decided what to do. They were just 2 men, trapped by a secret that was far bigger and darker than they could have ever imagined. We have to bury him properly, Royce said, breaking the long silence. Virgil, we can't leave him in that hole. Whatever he was still a man. He deserves a real grave. Fletcher nodded. It was the only thing that felt right, the only decent act they could perform in this whole ugly mess. They spent the morning digging a new grave, deep in the woods, far from the tainted ground of the cabin. It was hard, grueling work. Their bodies ached with hunger and exhaustion. But they kept going, driven by a desperate need to do something, anything, to counteract the evil they had discovered. They gently gathered Virgil's bones, wrapped them in an old blanket, and carried them to the new grave. They stood in silence as they lowered him into the earth. There were no prayers to say. What could they say? Fletcher shoveled the first scoop of dirt onto the bundle. The sound was horribly final. With that single act, they had crossed a line. They had found a body and reburied it in secret. They were no longer innocent bystanders. They were accomplices. When the grave was filled, Royce placed a large, flat stone to mark the spot. No name, no words, just a silent testament to a life that had been violently stolen. His family, Royce said quietly. They deserve to know what happened. Fletcher's stomach clenched into a tight knot. And what do we tell them, Royce? That our uncle was a master thief who murdered their loved one to cover his tracks? That we found the body and the stolen gold and then decided to hide it all? They'll throw us in jail and take the money. The truth is the truth, Royce insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth will destroy us, Fletcher shot back. And for what? To give answers to a family about a man who was a criminal himself? What good does that do anyone? Keeping the secret meant they could use the gold, they could escape, they could have a life. But it also meant they were no better than Theodore, living a lie, haunted by what they had done. Fletcher looked at the unmarked grave. He realized with a sinking heart that they had already made their choice. The moment they decided to rebury Virgil themselves, instead of going to the law, they had chosen the gold. They had chosen the lie. We wait, Fletcher said, his voice low and firm. We see if anyone comes asking questions. If his family shows up, we'll tell them. But if no one comes, we let the past stay buried. Royce looked at his brother, his eyes filled with a deep, profound disappointment. He saw what Fletcher was becoming, what they were both becoming. But he didn't argue. He just gave a slow, tired nod. And in that moment, the bond between them, the unspoken trust that had connected them their whole lives, began to crack. 3 days passed. They used a few of the coins to buy food and tools from a town a day's ride away. For the first time in their lives, they had full stomachs and money in their pockets. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like guilt. They started fixing the cabin, trying to build a new life over the rotten foundations of the old one. Max seemed to have forgotten about the grave. He was just a happy dog, content in his ignorance. Fletcher wished he could be more like Max. On the morning of the 4th day, they heard a horse. Fletcher was outside splitting logs. He froze, axe in hand. Royce appeared in the doorway of the cabin, his face as white as a sheet. They both knew who it could be. A man rode into the clearing. He was in his 40s with a weary face and a long, dusty coat. He dismounted slowly, his body stiff from a long ride. "Morning," the man said, his voice rough. "You the nephews who inherited this place?" "Yes, sir," Fletcher managed to say, his heart pounding. "Name's Cyrus Granger," the man said, his eyes scanning the property. "I live a few days east of here. Heard Theodore Quill passed. Just came to pay my respects." Granger, the same last name as Virgil. It had to be his brother. "We appreciate that," Fletcher said, choosing his words carefully. "Did you know our uncle?" "A long time ago," Cyrus said. "Before he shut himself away. I knew his friend better. My brother, Virgil." The air went still. Fletcher could feel Royce next to him, barely breathing. "I'll be direct with you boys," Cyrus went on, his voice heavy with a grief that was 15 years old. "My brother, Virgil, disappeared. Vanished without a trace. The last thing he told our mother was that he was coming here, to help Theodore with some repairs. We never saw him again. Theodore told us Virgil never showed up. Cyrus continued, his eyes pleading with them. We believed him. Why wouldn't we? But I always wondered. I have to ask. Did your uncle leave anything behind? A letter, a diary, anything that might tell us what happened to my brother? Our mother died never knowing. Please, if you found anything that could give us some peace. I'm begging you. The truth was right there, on the tip of Fletcher's tongue. This man deserved to know. He deserved to bury his brother. But then he thought of the gold, the life it could give them. He saw Royce take a step forward, his mouth opening. He was going to tell him. He was going to confess everything and destroy them both. No, sir, Fletcher said, the lie coming out quick and cold, cutting Royce off. We found nothing, just this rundown cabin and a pile of his debts. I'm sorry. We can't help you. Cyrus Granger's face fell. The last flicker of hope in his eyes died, and he looked like a broken man. He stared at Fletcher for a long moment, his gaze so intense that Fletcher had to fight the urge to look away. I understand, Cyrus said finally, his voice hollow. He turned and mounted his horse. If you do, find anything, we'll let you know, Fletcher lied again. Cyrus rode away, a lonely figure disappearing back into the forest. Royce turned to Fletcher, and the look on his face was one of pure betrayal. How could you? He whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that was colder than any winter wind. Fletcher had no answer. He just stood there, the weight of his lie pressing down on him, feeling like the lowest creature on earth. He had saved their future, but he had just destroyed his brother, and maybe himself. Royce didn't say another word. He turned and walked into the cabin, shutting the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Fletcher stood alone in the yard, listening to the hoofbeats of Cyrus Granger's horse fade into the distance, each one sounding like a nail being hammered into his coffin. That night was the longest of Fletcher's life. He and Royce were in the same small room, but they might as well have been on different planets. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Fletcher tried to talk to him, to explain, but Royce just turned his back. The rift between them was a physical thing now, a chasm that had opened up the moment Fletcher had told that lie. In the morning, Royce was gone. His blanket was folded. His small bag of belongings was missing. There was no note, just an empty space where his brother should have been. Panic seized Fletcher. Royce had left him. He had taken nothing, not a single gold coin. He had chosen poverty and loneliness over a life built on lies. He had chosen to leave Fletcher behind. Fletcher ran outside, screaming his brother's name into the cold morning air. Max ran with him, barking frantically, but the forest just swallowed the sound. Then he saw him. Royce was at the edge of the woods, standing over Virgil's hidden grave. He wasn't moving, just staring down at the flat stone that marked the spot. Fletcher approached slowly, his heart in his throat. I almost did it, Royce said, his voice rough. He didn't turn around. I walked all the way to the main road, but then I stopped, because I realized I have nowhere to go. Nothing. I have nothing but you. He finally turned to face Fletcher, and his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a terrible sorrow. And I stood on that road and I hated you, Fletch. I hated you for what you did. But most of all, I hated myself, for being too weak to stop you. I'm sorry, Fletcher whispered. Are you? Royce shot back. Because I don't think you are. I think you'd do it again. I think you'd lie to 100 men like Cyrus Granger if it meant you didn't have to be poor anymore. The words hit Fletcher like a physical blow, because they were true. And knowing they were true made him feel sick to his stomach. So what now? Fletcher asked, his voice cracking. Now, we live with it, Royce said, his voice devoid of all emotion. We take the damned money. We build this place up. We make the life we always wanted. And every single day, for the rest of our lives, we remember what it cost. We remember the man buried under our feet. And we remember the look on his brother's face. That will be our penance. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an absolution. It was a life sentence. They would live in a prison of their own making. A prison with nice walls and a full pantry, but a prison nonetheless. They walked back to the cabin together, the chasm between them still there, just bridged by a fragile truce of shared guilt. The work of building their new life began. But as Fletcher picked up his axe, he couldn't shake a terrifying thought. Cyrus Granger hadn't just been looking at him. As he'd sat on his horse, right before he rode away, his eyes had drifted down. Down to the ground. To the patch of dark, disturbed soil at the base of the old oak tree. The place where their nightmare had begun. He hadn't been defeated. He had been confirming a suspicion. And Fletcher suddenly knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that this wasn't over. Cyrus Granger was coming back. The next 6 months were a blur of hard work. They rebuilt the cabin, transforming it from a wreck into a solid, respectable home. They bought the surrounding 40 acres of land, the gold coins turning their sweat into deeds and ownership. They planted crops, built fences, and for the first time, they owned something. They had a home. To the outside world, they were just two hard-working brothers who had caught a lucky break. But every night, the lie sat between them at the dinner table. Royce would often sit by the fire, reading Theodore's diary of lies, as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. Fletcher would lie awake for hours. The image of Cyrus Granger's face burned into his mind. The guilt was a constant physical presence, a poison they swallowed every morning and choked on every night. They had their dream, but it was a nightmare in disguise. Then, one evening in early winter, it happened. Snow was falling, blanketing the world in a silent, deceptive purity. Max suddenly shot up from his spot by the fire, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He stood at the door, his hackles raised. Fletcher grabbed the heavy wood axe from beside the hearth. Royce stood behind him, his face pale. A single horseman emerged from the snowy woods. It was Cyrus Granger. But he wasn't alone this time. There were 2 other men with him, both with rifles cradled in their arms. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to collect. Cyrus dismounted and strode towards the cabin, a cruel smile on his face. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "We don't know what you're talking about," Fletcher said, his knuckles white on the handle of the axe. "Oh, I think you do," Cyrus sneered. "My brother Virgil wasn't the brightest man, but he told me everything. He told me about the gold he and your uncle were skimming, and he told me where they hid it when things got too hot. Right here. He was supposed to get his share and leave, but your uncle got greedy. I've been waiting 15 years for that old monster to die so I could come get what's mine." The story about his grieving mother, the search for peace. It was all a lie. A performance to see if they knew about the gold. Fletcher's own lie had confirmed it for him. "The gold is gone," Fletcher said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We turned it in to the authorities." Cyrus laughed. "Nice try, but I've been watching you spend it piece by piece. Now, you can give it to me and I'll let you live, or my friends and I can tear this place apart, and you, until we find it. Your choice." The 2 men with him raised their rifles, the black barrels pointing directly at Fletcher and Royce. This was it. The price for their secret. The ghosts of the past hadn't come to haunt them. They had come to kill them. In that split second, everything became clear to Fletcher. The guilt, the lies, the broken trust with his brother. It was all a cage, and he would rather die fighting for the truth than live another day inside it. He looked at Royce, and for the first time in months, he saw the same fire in his brother's eyes. They had made one terrible choice. They would not make another. "You'll get nothing from us," Royce said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't had since the day they arrived. "Wrong answer," Cyrus snarled, and signaled to his men. As the men advanced, Fletcher let out a yell and charged, swinging the axe not at Cyrus, but at the porch railing. Wood splintered and shattered. It was a distraction, a desperate, wild move. One of the riflemen turned toward the sound, and in that instant, Royce lunged from the doorway, tackling the man's legs. The rifle fired, the shot going wild, echoing through the silent, snowy forest. The second gunman leveled his rifle at Royce, but before he could pull the trigger, Max exploded from the cabin. A blur of fur and teeth, he launched himself at the man's throat. The man screamed, dropping his rifle as he fought off the snarling dog. Fletcher scrambled for the fallen rifle as Cyrus pulled a pistol from his coat. The world seemed to slow down. Fletcher saw the hammer of the pistol pull back. He saw the cold, murderous look in Cyrus's eyes. He wasn't going to make it. Then Royce was there. He slammed a heavy log from the woodpile into the back of Cyrus's legs. Cyrus roared in pain and stumbled, his shot firing into the dirt floor of the porch. Fletcher had the rifle now. He chambered around and pointed it at Cyrus, who was struggling to get up, his face a mask of fury. The other gunman was on the ground, his arm torn and bloody from Max's attack. It was over. They stood there in the snow, surrounded by the wreckage of their choices, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the cold air. They had won. They had survived. But the box of blood money was still inside. They tied the three men up. The fight had drained the last of the poison from their souls. They knew what they had to do. The next morning, they loaded Cyrus and his men onto a wagon. They put the heavy box of gold in with them, and they took Theodore's diary. They rode into town, to the sheriff's office, and they told him everything. They told him about the cabin, the diary, the grave. They told him about Virgil and Theodore and the lies. All of it. They held nothing back. They placed the box of gold on the sheriff's desk, a heavy, shining pile of evidence. The sheriff listened, his face grim. When they were finished, he looked at the gold, then at the two exhausted brothers. He told them the coins were from a legendary train robbery 20 years ago. The case was never solved. There was a reward for its return, a substantial one. Fletcher and Royce were cleared of any wrongdoing. The diary and the confession from a tied-up Cyrus Granger were proof enough that they were victims of circumstance. They wouldn't get to keep the fortune, the blood money that had nearly destroyed them. But the reward was more than enough. It was clean money, honest money, enough to give them the start they had always dreamed of. They still owned the land. They still had their home. They rode back to the cabin not as rich men, but as free men. The chasm between them was gone, filled in by the shared fight and the final brutal truth. The guilt was lifted. The ghosts were gone. That evening, they sat by the fire, Max sleeping at their feet. The cabin was quiet, peaceful for the first time. They had faced the darkness in their own hearts and chosen the light. They had found something more valuable than gold. They had found their way back to each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the old tracks, making everything clean and new. A true beginning. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and difficult choices collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means the world to us.